If you're hearing this, then the world I remember is a photograph left out in the rain, blurred, warped, and impossible to hold still. They called it the polar shift at first, as if naming it would make it sensible. Then the name became shorthand for everything that kept breaking after. The compass that no longer pointed, the seasons that traded places, the ocean that learned new moods. The maps we once trusted folded themselves into riddles. Whatever order we'd built came apart on a hinge we didn't see until it was too late. The sky stopped behaving like the sky. Some mornings it burns in a thin, rusty light like something behind glass. Other nights it shivers with auroral ribbons, green, violet, a ghostly map of currents nobody alive can chart. The weather learned to be violent and unpredictable, like a temper finally given free rein. Storms appear without procession. They arrive like a verdict. Rain now carries salt from seas that have moved hungry across coasts. Snow falls where it never fell before, and then melts into a choking slush that eats through what's left of the roads. Wind comes in knife edges and scours metal until city skeletons glint like bones in low light. Cities went first because they were full of what the world wanted most: people, machinery, energy. I remember a downtown skyline that used to look like promise. Now it looks like a set of ribs sticking out of an animal carcass. Towers stand half decayed, glass blown out, faces smooth with dust. Subways are mown through catacombs full of cold water and slick with algae. Streets used to hum with a million small lives. Now they are rivers of driftwood and ruined shopping trolleys, with the occasional ruined sedan like an old tooth. Bridges are mid-size, cracked, collapsed, or hanging like failed promises across canyons where rivers used to run freely. Where there were parks, there are salt flats and scrub that will not support the kind of life we took for granted. Farms that fed counties now gape with furrows of poisoned soil. Irrigation canals are dry, cracked like open mouths. The orchards turn to skeletons, and the grain fields to dust plains where the wind arranges the land into new, indifferent patterns. Old names, county, neighborhood, avenue, hang in speech like the names of ghosts. We still say them because words are one of the few things that refuse to die. Institutions, once the scaffolding of normalcy, dissolved in less than a season. Governments retreated into islands of bureaucracy, while the street-level hunger burned through the rest. The radio networks that used to deliver weather updates and election results now carry static and warnings, punctuated by a voice every few hours from some stubborn transmitter like me. Hospitals survive where doctors turned utility into craft, makeshift clinics in church basements or in the back rooms of libraries, sterile only by the discipline of improvisation. Schools are shelters, and courthouses are caches. The rule books are in ruins. What replaced them is regional patchwork authority, local councils, militias, cooperatives, each born of whatever leadership and weapons happened to survive the first chaos. Survivor groups are as varied as the wounds of the world. There are the foragers, who move like crows across the landscape picking what the broken world leaves behind. They trade in batteries and canned goods, in rumors and maps. There are the keepers, small communes that guard a spring or a greenhouse and tend it like a relic. There are road gangs, stitched together from desperate needs and better guns. They call themselves guardians or rulers depending on who's listening. And then there are the lone wolves, scavengers who have seen too much and speak too little. You learn to read these groups like weather, the posture of a camp, the flags they fly or don't, the way children are kept close. The markets that remain are barter systems built on trust so small they fit in a hand. A lamp, a handful of grain, a bolt of cloth. These become currencies when coin is a rumor and credit a memory. Libraries, stubborn as mold, keep themselves alive as repositories of paper knowledge. People come for the old manuals, plumbing, electronics, agriculture, because knowledge became a survival tool. Priests and technicians share pews and workbenches. Radio antennas sprout on rooftops like twisted prayers. I run a little of that circuit. my voice carried by a battered transmitter, a coil of wire, a pedal generator I crank when the batteries run down. I broadcast because someone has to record the small facts of our existence, where the water might still be, which roads are impassable, who you can trust. There is a constant, low sound under everything now. The scrape of sand across metal, the distant rumble of ships running aground where they never should have, the keening of birds that have forgotten migration. Smells have changed too, salt and rot, diesel and burning tang. The winters smell like old copper, the summers smell like ozone and the memory of ice that used to be. And yet, there is a tense, nervous life that pulses at the edges. People still gather. They trade recipes for willow charcoal filters. They show each other how to coax seedlings out of stubborn soil. They carve out places of music and reading and small foolishnesses, things that are not strictly necessary, but necessary enough to keep the human shape from collapsing. A child laughing in the distance can stop a storm for a second. A shared meal can do the same. We live with a constant anticipation, the tight, exhausted readiness of people who have learned to expect the worst but still hope otherwise. Every weather front is a chess piece. Every radio signal is a heartbeat. I keep the microphone close, not because I have all the answers, but because in the long hush between disasters, a voice, any voice, means that someone is still keeping watch. The landscape is broken, the institutions are ragged, our maps no longer point anywhere certain. But we keep moving, trading, singing, repairing. We keep listening. I kept my name for as long as it made sense to keep anything. It's Miles. Miles Harrington was what my mother called me when she was still allowed to say my whole name. Now it's just a thread I tug when sleep gets thin, when I need to remember a life that was not all scavenging and static. When the shift started, I worked in a small radio studio that smelled of coffee and vinyl. I thought my job was to tell people what the weather would do and what the mayor had decided. I was wrong about my job. It turned out the thing I did best was hold a microphone steady while the world reoriented itself. When the maps folded and the governments retreated into back rooms and batteries died, I found I had a talent that counted for something. I could coax a transmitter into a voice, and voices matter when everything else falls apart. Survival, in practice, is a lot less romantic than broadcasts make it sound. It looks like oil-smeared hands tightening bolts, like a bent tuning wrench and a coil of copper wire bent into an antenna that reaches up to catch a signal from a dying satellite or a stubborn ham operator 3 valleys away. It looks like trading a jar of canned peaches for a handful of AA batteries, and the labor of someone who still remembers how to fix a carburetor. It looks like learning to sleep in the day and listen at night, because people talk more when the dark covers them. I live in what used to be a brownstone with a lamp room on the roof. The roof is everything: clear sight lines, fewer rats, a wind that lets you dry things in an afternoon. I sleep on a packing crate turned mattress, wrapped in a wool blanket someone traded me for an old transistor. My radio setup is an altar. A battered bed frame holds the generator. A box of salvaged batteries stands like a small fort, and the microphone sits on a plank of wood that survived more storms than I care to count. A coil of copper, an old satellite dish, and a pole that used to be a flagstaff reach into the sky. On clear nights I can make out phantom glows of towns that are maybe alive, maybe not. I point the dish and I talk into the cold. Food is resource management, barter and ingenuity. I trade words and weather reports for jars of preserved food. I keep seeds, corn, beans, a stubborn apple scion wrapped in wax paper, because seeds are not just future food, they're arguments against finality. I tend a rooftop garden of 3 raised beds, using compost from kitchen scraps and a trickle irrigation system built from old tubing. Every sprout feels like a small miracle. When a seedling leaves a hole in the soil to peek at the world, I feel greed and gratitude both. Greed because I want all squalls and winters to die. Gratitude because it hasn't yet. Water is harder. I've learned filtration. Coarse cloth for silt. Charcoal trickles for taste, a last-stage disinfection with bleach measured like a prayer. I keep a blue enamel pot for boiling and a dented thermos that has seen me through 3 winters. I know where the old cistern in the library courtyard collects runoff in odd months. I mark it on a paper map in pencil. Maps are lies, but they're useful lies. What keeps me going is not the same as what keeps everyone else going. I keep going because the microphone is a small covenant. When I speak, someone listens. Sometimes it's a voice on the other end, a girl in the keeper's commune who swears she's learning to graft apple trees. Sometimes it's silence and the knowledge that my words are recorded, that someone a week from now might find the scrap and learn that this was how we breathed. Responsibility sits on my shoulders like a slow, heavy coat. I feel it like an ache. There are days where it's revenge against the void. If the world wants to end, I will not help it by being quiet. Hope lives in practical things. It lives in the list I keep. Fuel, batteries, flour, seeds, generator oil. It lives in the people who still show up at the weekly trade circle on the 3rd Sunday, bringing what they can. Mostly, though, it lives in the small connections. The laugh that slices through a bad week, the hand that steadies a ladder, the child who asks the questions that no adult wants to voice. The responsibility is both heavy and saline, like eating too much preserved lemon. To be a broadcaster in this time is to be a small lighthouse. I can't steer the whole ship, but I can flash the presence of land. Loss is a private currency that doesn't appear on barter lists. I lost a wife, Jenna, 3 winters after the first big melt took the bridge out and the hospital's generators failed. We argued about staying. She wanted to move inland to the keepers. I wanted to keep the transmitter alive. In the end, the world decided. Jenna's laugh is a fissure in my memory. Some nights I feel it like a bruise. I lost a brother to a road gang whose mercy was as thin as their rations. I lost a house that I used to know by the squeak of the 3rd stair, and a neighbor who left a baked loaf on my windowsill and never came back. Grief is a set of chores now. Cleaning, remembering, folding photographs in oilcloth so wind and rain do less damage. There is a ledger in my head where I tally mistakes. I remember once handing over a crate of batteries to a convoy that promised safe passage to a coastal spring. They lied. They took the batteries, the spare parts, and left with our names. I still have the burnt bucket they left behind as evidence. That memory is a compass. It points me away from easy trusting. But it also taught me something essential, hard lessons about the trade-offs between community and security. I have learned to listen not only to words, but to the small rhythms, the cadence of a laugh, the way someone's hands tremble when they tell a story. People reveal their truths in the ways they breathe. There are practical fears, too. Fuel runs in my blood as memory. I keep an eye on the oil, on the generator's teeth. A spare coil, a spark gap fixed with wire filched from a school science lab. These small things separate a night of broadcasting from a night of silence. My hands bear the calluses of 1,000 small repairs. Soldering the broken antenna feed, fashioning a new rotor from a scavenged motor, cleaning corrosion from battery terminals with citrus and patience. I keep a little packet of silica gel to keep moisture from destroying capacitors. These are small survivalisms. They are also rituals. When I tune the antenna, I feel purposeful, like I am pulling a thread through the dark. Trust is the currency second only to water. I have a handful of people I let inside my loop. Mara, who tends the rooftop garden when my hands are raw. Old Ben, who still knows how to read radar maps from before the collapse. Lucia, who runs the barter circle and always smells faintly of ozone, because she trades in salvaged solar panels. They are enough to remind me that I am not merely a voice with a microphone. I am a part of a ragged network that hums like an old engine. Every so often I test myself with an ethics exercise. If a child knocks at my door with frostbitten feet and a bandage of lies about how far they walked, do I give away the last of the seeds? Most days I find that I do. Sometimes I don't. The line between generosity and survival is a narrow ridge and we all walk it. The choices mark us. I have done things I am not proud of, and I have done things that still make my chest ache with their rightness. That ambivalence is part of being human. The world did not take that from us. At night, when the generator hums and the wind tells its old stories, I read messages into the crackle. I say the names of places I once loved and the dates I think might matter. I describe where the spring edge lies, how the current at the river mouth has shifted, how the keepers are teaching grafting. I read poems when the mood strikes because poems are small persistence. Sometimes I get a long, slow reply. Sometimes I get silence. Sometimes, miraculously, a laugh replies, a human sound that ricochets off the city's ribcage and tells me, in the simplest way, that someone else is awake. If survival is an action, then living is an art, and I try my hand at both. I tighten bolts and coax seedlings. I hand out biscuits and mend radios. I keep a cigarette lighter in my pocket to start fires and a carefully folded photograph in my wallet to start remembering. I keep talking because sound is survival. I keep listening because loneliness kills faster than hunger. And beneath it all, a stubborn little hope persists, not a conviction that the world will reset to what it was, but a belief that pieces can be gathered, legible again, and perhaps stitched into something new. My voice is ragged sometimes. Static chews at it, wind steals its edges. But when I say, this is miles on frequency, if you can hear me answer, I am making a promise I intend to keep. Not to cure the world, not to bring back what was lost. Only to be there, a light in the static, for as long as the generator will turn. They call it the crisis now, as if a single word could hold the slow, chaotic unraveling of everything we used to call climate. For us, the crisis had a day, not the day the sky cracked, because the sky had been cracking in fits for years, but the day the river forgot how to carry itself. The Missouri used to be a slow, dependable thing. One spring it swelled and then, with a cruelty that felt deliberate, it did not settle back. Channels redirected. Wetlands collapsed into salty marsh that every tide bit further into. Where we expected a floodplain now lay salt and glassy mud. That was the first visible sign that the old rules were gone. What really changed was the choreography of the planet's air and water. The polar shift, call it what you like, wasn't a single tectonic snap so much as a remapping of patterns. Jet streams wandered, carrying storms into places that had forgotten them, areas that used to be temperate baked into drought, coasts that used to be lifelines flooded again and again, each surge a lesson in how quickly infrastructure could be emptied of meaning. Thermals shuffled. Ocean currents slackened where they used to pull, and where the seas warmed, they warmed with appetite, feeding hurricanes with extra heat and sending salt inland with every new route. Permafrost, where it still existed, gave up its ancient prisoner gases and slid toward nothingness. The weather became both erratic and severe, long droughts punctuated by storms that arrived like iron doors slamming. I learned the language of the change in specific, useful ways. Storms now come in two flavors: the slow, grinding deluge that sits over a region and eats at soil and thought, and the convective hammer, bright, fast, and full of hail the size of fists. We get salt-slooped winds that taste of the sea and strip paint in an afternoon. We get feral blizzards that arrive in summer. The earth shifts its appetite. Some seeds thrive in the new short seasons, others die out. The science folks I used to listen to, before I became a voice more than a receiver, said the magnetic poles were wandering, and the oceanic conveyor that fed our climate was jittering. I cannot give you a laboratory paper on my roof. Only the observation that rivers lie now like cauterized wounds, and that rain is a currency more precious than gold. Survival grows harder every day because the ledger of resources gets smaller and more volatile. Water is the obvious one. Wells are contaminated by salt from tides marching inland. Aquifers that took millennia to fill now lie gutted or poisoned by industrial runoff that found new pathways. Rainfall that used to replenish reservoirs instead falls in torrents that the cracked earth cannot absorb. turning to runoff that carries soil away like dust. Food follows water. Crops fail because the timing of rains has divorced itself from the seasons and from the farmer's accustomed calendars. Seeds that germinate now die when a freak frost swings through in June. Pollinators, bees, moths have been fragmented into pockets. The old plagues of pesticides and habitat loss were kinder, at least predictable. Fuel is another. The pipelines that once hummed have ruptured or become contested ground. Diesel is a relic traded like contraband. We keep generators, yes, but oil runs thin and is burned with the sorrow of an end-of-line candle. Batteries die slowly and are hard to replace. Solar is a miracle when you have panels and a clear roof, but panels salt over, get cracked by hail, and the charge controllers corrode. Even knowledge is a resource now. Someone who knows how to jury-rig a pump is worth a dozen canned peaches. The human toll is a multiplication table for suffering. Institutions either contracted into smaller, hermetic enclaves of authority or vanished in cascades of failure. Hospitals that used to be vast machines became triage tents or morgues. Supply chains that once reached into every hamlet were interrupted and seldom restored. Lawfulness at scale evaporated. Local power filled the vacuum. Where there is authority now, it is either a ragged cooperative, people pooling skills and watching each other's kids, or a gang with guns and a ledger of tax-like demands. The gangs call themselves protectors sometimes. They keep order by removing options. There is a third type of authority, religious groups and tech salvage crews who build microinfrastructure and expect loyalty in return. Each model has its price. We have allies and enemies in equal measure. I remember Mara and her troop of keepers. They held a cistern in the old university courtyard and learnt, with the stubbornness of people who had once been gardeners, how to coax algae and fresh shoots from filth. They taught a handful of others to manage a closed-loop garden and to treat greywater into something usable. They became allies because they shared water points with our radio group when the rains were kind. They traded grafting techniques for battery work. The small acts of exchange, yeast for wiring, seeds for patching, kept entire neighborhoods breathing. Then there are the raiders, the highway cartels who turned scarcity into a business model. They do not always arrive with guns first. Sometimes they arrive with charm and a manifest and a convoy that promises security. They use information, maps, transmitter frequencies, weather patterns, to determine where the easy, soft caches exist, and when they meet resistance they escalate. I learned to recognize the smell of a planned raid from the way rumors travel. Sudden requests for extra meat, rumors of safe roads, strangers who ask too many questions about your generator size. They are efficient, cruel, and sometimes oddly bureaucratic, a perverse remnant of the old world's logistics. I have had to lie. I have had to barricade. I have been at the edge of giving up valuable parts and at the edge of shooting someone who once sang lullabies in the old neighborhood. Weather itself is a predator. There was a winter 3 years back when the temperature inverted. The surface air froze while a strange warm layer above trapped moisture, and the result was a glaze frost that widened like a mirror across the roofs. It crushed gardens with weight, snapped branches, and shorted panels. Last summer, a storm arrived from an ocean nobody expected to send such a thing inland. It lasted 12 hours and left brackish floodwater across streets that had been dry for a decade. We lost 2 weeks of seed stock to that water. That's how survival becomes harder. One event can spell the end of months of careful saving. We face physical and mechanical limitations as well. My generator, an old Honda someone salvaged and then sold to me for a favor, consumes oil like a mouth with no teeth. The carburetor floods if the humidity leaps, and it takes a delicate touch to prime it after a rain. Batteries must be cycled carefully to avoid sulfation. Lead-acid chemistry is as unforgiving as a grudge. Solar arrays must be angled for a sky that no longer follows the same path. The sun's apparent track shifts enough with the changed seasons that a fixed array loses efficiency if you do not adjust it. It's a messy, daily arithmetic. How many hours of charge will 2 panels give us? How long will the generator run if we split usage? How many liters can we spare for boiler sterilization versus cooking? There are practical, actionable things we do because they work, even if they do not feel like heroics. For anyone listening, if you have a tin, a tarp, and a slope, make a solar still in a pinch. A shallow pit, a cup centered under clear plastic weighted edges. You will coax condensation from the earth. Not a lot, but enough to keep a throat from chalking. For filtration, coarse cloth first, then sand charcoal layers if you can arrange them. Charcoal traps taste and organics. Sand removes grit, and finally boil for a full minute longer at high altitudes. Bleach dosages, good, unscented household bleach, are small but precise. 4 drops per liter in clear water is a rule we learned by careful, painful trial. When in doubt, err on the side of caution with dosing, but remember that bleach does degrade over time. A folded, wax paper map with marked springs is better than a GPS that will die in 5 uses. Travel light. Travel early in the morning or late in the day when the winds are low. Mark caches with mundane signs, a string of bottle caps, a certain cairn, so the cache isn't obvious to casual sight. Electrical maintenance is an art. Clean terminals with vinegar and a wire brush. Keep a small tub of distilled water for top-up. Rotate batteries so none sit at the bottom of a charge curve too long. Use low-draw LED lamps. Convert a radio rig to run from 12V when you can. If you have a motor and a bike, build a pedal generator for emergencies. A human crank will not run a heater, but it will keep a radio alive long enough to send a message. Security is trickier. Never advertise your stock in the open market. Run decoy levels. Offer the illusion of a bigger stock to draw raiders away from crucial caches. Build an outer perimeter that looks more dangerous than it is. Thorny branches, trip wires, simple bells or noisy cans, and a well-placed broken window to suggest occupancy. Move children inward. Keep names out of the open. People trade in names as if they were passwords, and names travel with rumors. All this practical counsel sits in the same grim room as the hard choices. We had a decision last autumn. A convoy to an inland reservoir. 3 days' ride across a salt plain that was a flat, bright lie. Word was that the reservoir had been left intact, old piping, a pump house that still smelled faintly of oil. Mara argued that we send a small team. Lucia argued for a larger escort. Ben wanted a technical crew to ensure the pump could be restarted. I argued to broadcast the trip schedule so others could avoid the path. In the end, we tried secrecy and transparency at once and paid for it. A road gang watched, learned, and hit the convoy on the return. We lost 3 people and our precious spare alternator. The alternator is now a memory. 2 people did not come back. Those losses are the kind of arithmetic that turns resource scarcity into moral calculus. If we had waited, maybe the reservoir would have been taken by someone else. If we had moved faster, maybe we'd have been smarter. There is no clean solution. That's the core of the crisis. It is not a single enemy, but a multiplication of small edges. The skewed weather, the lost infrastructure, the human hunger that manufactures predators out of necessity. Each morning I tune the antenna and listen for reports. A flooded lane here, a new frost line there, a band of scavengers moving east. I broadcast what I can, warnings, coordinates of safe wells, tips on seed saving, and sometimes those broadcasts change trajectories. Once we saved a family because of a frequency I kept open late, because someone heard them call for a sputtering generator part, and we happened to have one. Those are the victories that count more than the losses. We live inside a growing pressure. Every resource is a story with an expiration date. The crisis is not something we can outrun forever, but it is something we respond to, day in and day out, with tools and trade, with cunning and compassion. My conflict is not only to keep the transmitter alive or the rooftop garden fed. It is to hold my people's humanity in the face of incentives that punish compassion. Every decision is weighted now. Do we share the last oil with travelers who might be raiders? Do we risk broadcasting the location of a cache because someone might need it? Those choices are the real battleground. So I keep the mic warm and the map folded, and the list of spare parts in my head. I watch the sky for the shape of a storm, and I watch the road for the curve of dust that means tires. I teach Mara how to solder a diode, and she teaches me how to graft an apple that refuses to die. We argue and we laugh and sometimes we cry, because laughter is a tool too, a way to loosen a chest tightened by grief. The crisis is vast, our actions are small, but small things bought us another day, and in the arithmetic of extinction, another day is everything. They say the world tightens like a fist before it strikes. For months the pressure had been a dull ache, fuel counts that dropped a fraction each week, jars of pickles that shrank in my stores, the garden promising a harvest, and then dying overnight to a frost that had no business in late May. Then the pressure found a place to focus, and everything changed. The things that had been manageable became urgent. The small anxieties we could handle in spare hours turned into decisions that swallowed days. The week it started in earnest, the sky was an ugly bruise, heavy with the sort of humidity that makes metal talk to itself. I remember the sound because it was the moment the rooftop hummed with small, panicked labor. Mara and I balancing jars, Ben fussing with the carburetor, Lucia sorting seed packets as if the order of them could stave off chaos. We had been rationing fuel, as always, 3 hours of generator per day, no exceptions, and the list in my head kept getting longer. Fix the alternator, barter for oil, save batteries for real emergencies. Then the convoy came through. Convoys mean different things now. Sometimes they are saints, a string of people who traded a windmill blade for a pulley and keep moving, sowing small miracles. Sometimes they are angels with teeth, and the smile is a prelude. This one was the latter. They arrived at dusk, a lean, organized line of men and women in patched jackets, rifles slung visibly enough to be a threat and discreet enough to feel professional. They called themselves a protection roster, and their leader, if you could call him that, had the teacher's voice and a smile that could unhinge your prudence. He praised the transmitter first, as if that mattered. "We heard you," he told me. "Your voice carries far." That was true. It carried farther than I ever intended. Praise is a currency now. It buys the space to ask for things. They wanted to trade. A new pump head for the old alternator, safe passage to the North Road in exchange for fuel. He said the words people want to hear: maintenance, roots, protection. They offered a week's worth of canned meat and 2 gallons of oil. I almost signed. I remember why I didn't in the end. The way the man's eyes flicked to the rooftop garden, as if the seedlings were a bank account. I remember the way his second looked at Mara with a smile that was not a smile. I remember the pause in his speech when I asked them to camp outside and leave a token for the barter table. The pause told me all I needed. We turned them away. That night someone on the fringe of their camp took a lamp from our balcony and left a note nailed to the railing, a promise or a warning, I couldn't tell which. The lamp was a small thing, but it was the last of the bright glassware we owned. Mara cried when she saw the empty hook. That crying settled in my chest like a physical weight. Then the raid came 3 nights later, while the city breathed in the thin, poisoned sleep of a hot front. They hit low and fast at the east side storage, where Lucia kept spare panels and Ben's scavenged alternator. We had a lookout system, bells on wire, a path of clattering cans. It wasn't perfect, but it had kept us safe from smaller thieves. That night the raiders moved like water, silent and patient. They cut the tripwire before the bells could sing. They moved in the spaces people assumed were still private. By the time we reached the courtyard, gear was gone and the alternator lay in pieces, a carcass. We fought in the small way people fight when they have no formal armies. A thrown welding rod, a shouted name, someone flung into a wall. Nothing cinematic, just the ugly, animal flailing of people with too much fear and too few options. 2 men were taken. One of them was Tomas, who had once played clarinet in the old municipal band and now turned to the pump as if the world could still be tuned. We found his scarf, cut and bloody, caught in a barbed end. The raiders left a message this time. A scrap of cloth with an emblem we'd seen before, the mark of a road gang that had learned logistics and grace in equal measure. After the raid, the atmosphere was a different kind of wet. People did not sleep as much. They stitched the wounds tighter and we counted everything again. Food, water, seeds. Each loss made the ledger's ink darker. Some argued for retreat, gather what we can, and move south where the old maps suggested more rain. Others argued to fortify. The keepers wanted to trade drills for diesel. Lucia suggested forming a guard rotation and teaching more people to solder and maintain a generator. I wanted something else, information. I wanted to know which way the raiders had turned, their routes, who they had met. Intelligence is a kind of power now. Knowing where they moved is almost the difference between a raid and the survival of a neighbor. And then the rumor began to move like something alive. The Blue Spring. Rumors are strange currency. They can starve a camp or feed an army. The Blue Spring was first a whisper in the barter circle, an inland reservoir, a natural pool whose source had been sheltered by a collapsed limestone shelf, and whose water was, supposedly, sweeter than anything people had tasted in years. It was said that an old municipal engineer had kept the valve system intact, and that a small community had learned to desalinize and cycle water. Some said they had a solar concentrator enough to run a pump all day. Others said Blue Spring had a stock of seed varieties and a catalog of pre-collapse horticultural knowledge. The Blue Spring became a magnet for hope. We had heard things like this before. There was the lighthouse that supposedly still had a diesel reserve, and the School of the North that was rumored to be a tech haven. Those turned out to be a smudge of truth wrapped in decades of wishful thinking. Still, I took the rumor seriously because rumors are how people navigate now. They indicate desire and they indicate movement. Whoever started the Blue Spring story wanted something. Recruits, trade, protection. Or perhaps someone simply wanted to believe. Lucia pressed me to broadcast. "Tell them," she said. "Tell them we have the coordinates so people can organize and move as a caravan." Ben wanted secrecy. He wanted a small, skilled party that could take a pump and leave before anyone knew. Mara wanted to hurry and send scouts. She wanted life to come to her garden like a tide. I had to decide. Every broadcast is a needle. You stitch hope into a wound, and sometimes the wound heals. Sometimes you invite scavengers. So I baited the line. On air, I spoke in the careful, worn cadences of someone balancing truth with the lives tied to it. I did not give coordinates. I said only, Blue Spring may be a thing. If you think you have a lead, check in on frequency 920 at dusk. If you carry a map, bring it. If you can trade labor, bring it. If you are armed, do not come alone. The phrasing was deliberate. I hoped to attract helpers, not hordes. The first reply was a voice that said nothing at all, just a long, ragged breath and a laugh that sounded like a cliff face breaking. Then an older woman answered, a soft voice that called herself Mother Inez, saying that her children had heard of the Blue Spring from a convoy that passed months ago, and that they had traced a route that worked in winter. A trader from the old highways, who went by the name Bo, checked in and offered a lead. A pump house with a working engine 40 miles north, if you could get through a salt plain that had turned the tires to paste last summer. The responses were a map of possibilities. But where there is possibility, there is always an angle. The protection roster heard the chatter and showed up with a different tone this time, offering to escort anyone who wanted to go. "We'll charge a small fee," their leader said, as if fees were small things now. The protection for hire model is elegant in its simplicity. You pay with resources you cannot spare and gain a route that the road gang might otherwise call theirs. It was a proposition designed to split communities and isolate the poor, dressed as a public service. Tensions rose. People started arming more openly. The rooftop garden had to learn to be less ornate because flowers attract bees and bees attract observation. We dug caches in the library archives and moved our store of seed packets into a hollowed set of encyclopedias. Tomas did not come back. His absence sat in conversations like a live coal. The raid's mark remained on the community's face. We began to teach the young how to listen and how to be invisible if needed. We taught them not to carry names like banners. The moral questions multiplied. Should we set out for Blue Spring if it is real and leave the weak behind? Should we stay and fortify and risk being starved out? On radio, I heard worse dilemmas. One small commune had found a cache of antibiotics and decided to auction it rather than distribute it freely, because they feared being cleansed by raiders if they broadcast generosity. Another group burned their seed bank to force migration and make their position temporary. Survival had pushed people into hard trade-offs between compassion and security. I found myself changing when I thought I had little room left to change. I began to measure people's intentions by the small habits they couldn't fake. How someone treated an old wrench, the way they closed a door, whether they left scraps for the stray cats. I measured myself in the same way. Some nights I woke thinking of Jenna, the decisions that had led to the workbench or the hospital, the choice of radio over immediate flight. I asked myself if I had been proud or cowardly. I had defended the transmitter because voices mattered. I had also left someone who should have mattered more. Those ghosts are slippery in daylight and precise at night. We sent scouts. Mara, elated and terrified, was one of them. She left with a small kit, an empty thermos, a set of seeds, a soldering kit, and Tomas's old scarf wrapped around her shoulders. She moved light and careful, a small silhouette against the salt plains. I waited with the radio on, listening to the ping of other transmitters, praying like a person who has learned to pray to small practical gods. Days stretched long. The world outside was a study in waiting. The wind moved sand into new thickets. Gulls scoured the emptied riverbeds for anything to be scavenged. A distant convoy of trucks made the horizon quake for an hour, and then was gone. Each time a dust plume rose on the road, our hearts did too. Sometimes it was a traitor, sometimes it was a threat. We learned not to celebrate until bodies were counted and names spoken. Finally, Mara's voice returned. It was thin and bright with the kind of news that can unbalance a community. "There is water," she said. "Not a lot, but moving. There is a pump house and a group of people who call themselves the harbor. They have a DeSalle ring and they will trade for parts and labor." Her words were a beacon and a hammer. People cheered, then argued, then packed. Plans were made and broken like brittle twigs, and yet there were harbingers. The protection roster vanished the night before departure. Their camp simply cleared. A trail of burnt embers showed an organized pullout. Then, on the morning we left, 3 men carrying rifles blocked the east exit. They were not the protection roster. They were a road gang and they wanted a toll. We bartered a week's oil, a box of canned meat, and a promise of safe passage in the future, promises that taste like ash the moment you say them. We lost a crate of supplies we had counted as essential. I felt the ledger close a little more. The caravan left under a sky that threatened both rain and hail. We drove the first day with an unease that was thicker than the dust. The road condensed rumor into a visible thing, and rumor can be dangerous when it becomes traffic. We moved in a line. Rickety vehicles, a cart pulled by a tired mule someone had coaxed back to work. The radio car where I sat with the transmitter heated on my lap like a sleeping animal. The further we went, the more evidence there was of the world's new rules. Bridges half-backed into the void, forests of snapped power poles, farms reclaimed by salt. Each marker was a page in a book where the author had used fewer words. Trust phrase on the road. You learn quickly who keeps to watch, who sneaks, who hoards. Arguments flare over who takes the lead and who brings up the rear. The closeness of travel makes secrets impossible to hide. On the second night, a disagreement over rations became a fight. It was stopped before blood. but the look in one man's eye afterward told me that he had been cataloging us for his own benefit. Trust is a transaction that can be taxed out of you. The rising action is not one big thing, but a series of small escalations that add weight until the rope snaps. For us, the snap was less a spectacular event than a confluence. A day of bad weather, a wrong fork in the road, a contingent of men with better guns. When it happened, it felt inevitable and surprised me at once. We were not ready for everything, whoever is. But we moved forward anyway because hope had teeth and because every day we stayed put felt like a slow concession to decay. That is how tension builds. In the counting, the deciding, the arguing, the small acts of bravery, and the betrayals that are sometimes born of hunger and sometimes of cruelty. The blue spring was a promise that pushed us into motion and turned our lives into a bet. I do not pretend to be innocent of that gamble. I pushed broadcasts that started the caravan. I told people that hope existed in a particular tone that sounded like certainty. Now, with engines humming and dust on our boots, the real test was beginning. The blue spring was more beautiful than the rumors allowed it to be, a taunt and a mercy both. We came over a ridge that morning, and the plane fell away into a hollow of limestone like a bowl. At the bottom of that bowl, water lay in a blue that did not belong to our world anymore. Not the sick green puddles of the riverbed, but a clean, hard blue that held light like a promise. Limestone had sheltered it. A half-collapsed rock arch funneled runoff into a narrow, reed-choked inlet, and beneath that arch a pump house crouched, its metal roof patched and its concrete still firm. Someone had cared for it. The harbor met us like a cautious blessing. They were not many, 24 people, maybe less, and they moved with the economy of practice. They wore the kind of quiet clothing that told you they had chosen function over show. Patched waterproofs, layers for cold nights, hands that were practiced at ropes and wrenches. Their leader was a woman with a knot of silver hair and eyes that saw every person 3 steps ahead. They called themselves the harbor because, they said, they kept things afloat. They had a desal ring, an improvised circuit of settling tanks and a small, brilliantly rebuilt reverse osmosis rig fed by 2 battered solar concentrators and a diesel pump. They had a set of rules hung on a board in the pump house. Take only what you need, offer labor in return, the technologies are to be shared. No outsiders camped within sightline without consent. It felt like walking into a church. People do better when there is ritual. We traded an alternator part, patched from memory and loans, and a week's worth of bread for first access to the storage tanks. We filled jerry cans in lines, 2 by 2, laughing in a brittle way at the absurdity of lining up for water as if the old world had returned. For a moment, the caravan breathed differently. Tomas grinned with a kind of ridiculous gratitude, and Mara's hands shook as she carried a bucket that was half full of clean, cold life. Then the sky changed. You knew the weather had turned wrong long before you saw it. The air went heavy, as if someone had closed the lid on the valley. An auroral smear rose like a bruise across the northern horizon, colors we had started to name with warning. The magnetic air tasted metallic and the hair on my arm stood up. Electronics hiccuped. Ben swore softly and tightened a bolt on the pump. The harbor's women exchanged a glance and their leader barked orders. Secure the tanks. Get the concentrators down. Distribute more jerry cans. Move children to the sheltering arch. We had been warned in our frequency feeds, static oddities, pings at odd intervals. But warnings are only useful when you have the time to do anything with them. We did not. The storm was an animal of a new breed. Not merely wind, but a convective wall that arrived with salt spray, hail, and a low, subsonic thunder that made the ground tremble like a living thing. For hours it struck the bowl, hammering at the stone, shredding the reeds and hurling grit like shot. The solar concentrators shuddered under impacts. The reverse osmosis rig spat and then blessed us with sputtering water, and then, because nothing is simple in this world, the pump started to cough. That was when the raiders chose to come. They were not the protection roster this time. They were a different band, slicker, more practiced, with a taste for quick logistics and a cruelty that read from their faces like boredom. They came in 3 trucks, blackened and fast, their flags done up with the road gang emblem, a curved arrow like a noose. They had learned to time storms, to use the confusion to their advantage, to move when the world distracted the rest of us. They rolled in like vultures, engines a dull roar under the storm's scream. Tension tightened to a wire. The harbor moved with the precision of people who had rehearsed 100 griefs. They shoved children into the arch and braced tanks with rope and sandbags. The raiders did not want to starve us. They wanted to own what kept people alive. Their leader stepped out and raised a hand, then spoke in a voice that had the calm of someone who had never had to ask for mercy. "Valuable infrastructure," he said. "We'll take the pump house. You can work for us or you can watch it leave." The harbor's leader answered him with a list of laws and principles, but the raiders' people had guns and a statute of hunger. Words at that angle are paper and paper tears. We could have negotiated. We could have traded all the jerry cans in the world. But negotiation in that moment felt like handing over a limb to save a finger. The harbor's leader made a quick calculation and then turned to our caravan with a look that asked the impossible. "We can run the pumps long enough to fill every tank," she said, "but we need hands. We need the generator for continuous pressure. If we can fill the storage, maybe we can move 2 days' worth of water away before they take this place. If the water stayed, maybe they'd settle into a siege and ration in a way that would break men's hearts and minds but keep bodies alive. If the water left with us, maybe we could trade and spread the load. If the water stayed, perhaps it would be seized and used to consolidate power. The choices were all traps. I remember thinking of Jenna in that moment, of all the small compromises that had added up to the decisions we live by. I remember thinking of the transmitter, of its crackly light on my lap, the way its presence kept other voices alive. The pump was louder than the radio in that minute. A pump saves bodies in the next hour. A radio saves stories in the next century. Do you run toward the immediate need or toward the long, thin pulse of accountability? The question was a blade. The harbor's leader looked at me. "Miles," she said, "we need the generator. Can you run it?" It wasn't a question. It was the position of responsibility pressed into the one person who could make that choice. If I ran the generator at full tilt, I could keep the pump at pressure and the reverse osmosis unit humming. The diesel would burn fast, faster than any tally we had, but if we filled the tanks, we could get people away with water. If I used the generator, the transmitter went dark. No more coordinated defenses, no more calls for help, and no way to warn other caravans that the road was hot with raiders. I could also, perhaps, attract the raiders' attention to myself, making the pump house a focal point and allowing others to slip away. It felt like choosing which people to save. I made the choice before my chest finished the ache. I threw the generator's choke, and the Honda caught with a cough like a living thing awakening. I pushed the throttle, watched the needle climb into the green, then the yellow. Ben and 2 harbor techs shunted the belts, connected the pump as if the delicate gremlins of engineering had been tamed by desperation. Water began to gush into tanks. The roar of the engine was a small, holy noise. I could feel the diesel in my hands like a pulse. That's when the raiders moved. They hit the perimeter with a violence that had the precision of practice. They tried to cut power lines, to smash the hoses, to seize the control panel. Mara and a few others leapt to defend the lines. The fight was not cinematic. It was the ugly business of people who have learned to value life over civility. Welding rods and shouted names. Someone clubbing a man with a spare pipe. Someone else stabbing a tire to disable a truck. I had no weapons. What good is a microphone when bullets fly? But I had a generator and a few small guns the harbor handed me, shaking hands and a grip on hot metal. The choice pressed against me. Stay and hold the generator, or run and use the broadcast to lure help. If I broadcast, I risked bringing other groups into the valley, help maybe, but also a stampede of hunger. If I stayed, I risked the radio dying, and with it, the fragile thread that connected a dispersed world. I thought of the child with the laugh who had filled my kitchen with crumbs, and the old man who traded his walking stick for a battery. I thought of the people who had come this far with me because my voice had told them it was worth the gamble. I thought of Jenna, and the night decisions folded into day like thin paper. I chose the pump. I cut the mic, not with a dramatic gesture but with a slow, precise motion. The transmitter's light blinked and then went steady dark. For a second the silence was a physical thing, like a wall. Then I opened the generator's throttle and leaned into the metal. We filled tanks. We moved children into vehicles. We loaded jerry cans onto carts. People who had been arguing minutes before now moved with the economy of shared purpose. Mercy has a choreography. The raiders converged on me as the sky dissolved into metallic rain. One of them, a man with a face I recognized from a passing convoy, came at me with a crowbar. The generator's thrum muffled his words. I swung a heavy wrench because it was all I had. The world narrowed to hits and breaths and the taste of grit. Somewhere in the melee Mara's voice rose like a small instrument, calling people's names, organizing escape. I am no fool in the telling. Staying is rarely clean heroism. I bled. I broke a rib on a truck hood when I dove to shut a valve. Ben got grazed. Someone took a shot at the pump casing and it hissed, a thin, terrible sound. For a moment I imagined the whole bowl filling with mud and iron, the blue dissolving into a bruise. We had filled 2 tanks to the brim when the worst part hit. A tidal surge of saline rain, driven by the storm's low pressure, and a strange sea swell that had no business being inland. Water rushed the bowl's lip and sent a curtain of brackish spray across the pump house. The surge took the sense out of the air. You could not hear for the sheer volume. The harbor leader barked, "Move. Get what you can." I looked at the last hose and thought about fuel counts, about the radio dark at my feet, about 1,000 small regrets. There was a choice left that felt like a last, hot coin. Blow the pump to deny it to the raiders, or hold it and risk being taken alive with it. If I blew it, I could scatter the immediate threat but take an infrastructure we might never rebuild. If I held it, we might fill the last tank and escape, or we might die under a flag of salt and old dreams. I thought briefly of Jenna, and of the way she used to patch a storm window with tape, of how she'd never have asked me to be safe and small. I made the decision by weight. I cut the fuel line to the reserve, routed it to a temporary bladder we had, and forced the generator to drink the last of its oil. It coughed, and in that cough the pump roared like a grateful animal. The tanks filled. We tipped the last jerry can into a child's arms and I watched the convoy roll, slow, rickety, miraculous, out of the bowl. Mara waved. Her face was streaked with salt and soil and a grin that said more than words could. When the trucks left, the raiders found their prize diminished. They had the pump house but no full tanks. They had a short victory and a longer thirst. They left with a crate of what they could carry and a threat that sounded like a promise. I slumped against the generator and felt everything that mattered to me ache. The radio was dark. The sky was a bruise and the storm had not yet spent itself. I had kept the water. They were moving with it, but at the price of a voice gone silent and a generator on its last breaths. In the hush that followed, between the wail of the storm and the click of cooling metal, I sat very still. My hands smelled of diesel and blood. My ribs tightened when I breathed. I thought of all the small decisions that began as reasonable compromises and wove themselves into the life I had. I thought of the ledger of mistakes and of the odd arithmetic of survival that makes heroes of some and villains of others. Was it the right choice? I could already see 100 ways it might not be. Without the transmitter, other camps would not know where the blue spring had been, or that it had water for only a little while longer. Perhaps other groups would come later and find nothing but an emptied pump house, and a valley full of sore, angry raiders. Perhaps I had gambled the long thread of connection for an immediate river of mercy. That was a calculus I would sleep with for a long time. But in that instant, the thing that felt most true was simpler. The caravan had water. Children slept in the back of trucks with cheeks full and eyes like moons. Tomas's scarf was wrapped around a boy who would, for a while, not remember hunger. People were alive who might have been dead otherwise. At the center of the storm, with the generator ticking toward silence, I understood what responsibility felt like. An ugly, precise urgency that demanded you choose even when the answers were not clean. The generator coughed and then sobbed into silence. I put my hand on its metal flank like you might touch the forehead of a dying friend. The transmitter stayed dark, its dial a small, accusing absence. I had given the world a night of water and taken from it a night of voice. When you are alive in a time like this, you learn to live with broken trade-offs. The storm would pass. The raiders would leave or stay as they pleased. The harbor might rebuild or be taken over. The caravan would move and make a new ledger of debts and favors. I sat in the pump house and let the rain clean the salt from my face, and I spoke aloud into the quiet, because even when the mic is dead, a voice is still a thing you owe to the people you love. "This is Miles," I said to the empty room and the cooling metal. "We did what we could." The storm left the valley like a thing that had taken its fill and wandered off, all sudden silence and a strange, brittle clean. The air tasted of copper and salt. The reeds were flattened and chewed. The blue of the spring had been mudded at the edges by the rush, but the heart of it still held light. For a while, you could hear nothing but people breathing, a kind of private music after the public violence. We had water. That was the immediate, blunt fact that both saved us and sentenced me. The caravan rolled out with jerry cans and sleeping children, the trucks dented and dusted but alive. Mara sat on the tailgate of one of them and sang with a voice pulled thin by too many nights. Tomas's scarf was gone where a boy wrapped it around his knees. The harbor's leader, a woman who tightened her jaw like a fist when she thought no one watched, handed me a bent wrench and a paper cup of tea that tasted of grit and smoke. "You did what needed doing," she said, "and I realized you can't always trust the sound of consolation. Sometimes it is a rod of wood disguised as a hand." The raiders took the pump house that night, leaving us the carcass and a handful of busted valves. They left with a crate of spanners and the last of our diesel. They left with a threat that hung heavy in the valley like the storm's last breath. But they did not take everything. They did not take the laughter in the trucks, the handful of seedlings still clinging stubbornly to my rooftop, or the way the harbor taught a small boy to tether a pulley with reverence. We counted bodies and inventory with the mechanical calm people learn when they have to. Ben cleaned his grazed arm with boiled water and vinegar, the cuts turning into pale, patient moons. Mara wept over the missing lamp, years of small kindnesses compressed into an empty hook. Lucia cursed softly and replaced seed packets into waxed envelopes with hands that trembled but did not falter. Tomas, missing, was a hole you circled in speech. We said his name because names are ways to keep people from blowing away with memory. My chest was a ledger of choices. I had cut the radio to feed the pump. In doing so, I had traded a thread that connected farms and caravans and ragged towns for a river of immediate mercy. The microphone was cold in its housing, its lamp a small black eye. There is no clean arithmetic here. I count the children who slept warm that night and measure that against the nights when other camps would not know where the water had been. I try to carry both facts without letting one crush the other. The harbor remained, strangely, a place of pragmatic ritual. They had rules written on a slat of wood. Take only what you need, offer labor in return, knowledge must be shared. Those rules knit a kind of fragile trust, and trust is what lets people rebuild, even a little. They invited some of us to stay and help mend the pump house, to learn the DeSalle rig's quirks. I said no at first. The transmitter felt like a weight and a responsibility, but an old logic tugged at me. If you cannot be everywhere, be useful where you stand. I stayed 2 days and learned a few things that would matter later. Reverse osmosis membranes must be rinsed carefully after a clog, and a small charcoal profilter will double membrane life. Those details live in my hands like new calluses. The environmental ledger is complicated. The spring was a localized mercy, a pocket of ecosystem stubbornness held in limestone's belly. Around it, the land still bore the marks of our reach and ruin. Salt streaks on tree trunks, fields turned to glassy silt, migration routes of birds that had shortened to fit new seasonal beats. But pockets of repair existed. Reedy grasses held root and kept the banks from blowing away. Microbial mats in quiet eddies began to take up pigment again like someone re-inking a page. The harbor had nurtured a shallow bed of nitrogen-fixing plants in a belt that kept the immediate catchment from salting over too quickly. Those measures would not save the world, but they saved a margin, and margins add up. Inside that margin, people made choices that counted. We built caches in places that did not look like caches. A hollowed encyclopedia, a false bottom crate, a row of clay pots cemented, then buried under a stone. I began to think small again. The generator, for all its service, was beyond my ability to coax back to life without a fresh alternator and better fuel. I used the last of its oil in the bowl and felt the cost in my ribs and in the steady, accusing silence of the dark transmitter. But silence is not the same as absence. I found ways to make sound small and sharp. A hand-cranked emergency buzzer, a makeshift Morse key cobbled from a bent nail and a jar lid, a low-power beacon driven by a single, half-charged battery. It is not radio in the way I used to know it, but it is a bridge. Sitting on the pump house roof one late afternoon, Mara and I talked about the arithmetic of hope. She, who had once been a florist and now knew the names of drought-hardy rootstocks like scripture, told me she'd seen the boy who wore Tomas's scarf the day he left the convoy. He had water in his hands and mud on his knees and a grin the size of a small sun. We kept one thing, she said. That matters. It does matter. Children fed and sleeping are the clearest evidence anyone can demand that an ugly trade bought something pure. But I still think in other currencies. The quiet networks my voice kept alive, the lives that might have been rerouted because some outpost heard a warning. I resolved, messy and stubborn, to return to that work. The harbor taught me skills. In return, I promised to rebuild a voice, not the old one that sought to be omnipresent, but a careful one that would do low-power checks, short bursts at fixed times, and coded calls that trusted those who listened. Rekindling the transmitter would take parts and patience. We traded a season of garden produce for a salvaged capacitor and a roll of insulated wire. Lucia traded knowledge of jagged trade routes for a diode that stopped backfeed to the solar array. Ben taught me to make a crude voltage regulator from an old radio's guts. It was all small alchemy, soldering, rewiring, and making a power budget like a prayer. We devised a schedule, an hourly pulse at dawn and dusk, a single frequency ping so that other operators could triangulate our position with minimal power. It is a paltry choir compared to the broadband chorus I once ran, but in this world, paltry things matter. There is a new humility in me now, and a new pragmatism. I learned that sometimes mercy requires immediate sacrifice. I also learned that the long thread of connection must be reknit slowly, and with care so that it does not fray when storms hit. I learned to keep a split kit, one set of parts and fuel for emergency water, and another set for communication. The ledger is now a ledger of redundancies. Guilt visits in the night. I wake sometimes with the weight of the dark microphone in my palms and think of those who did not travel with the caravan. I think of Tomas in the way you think of things you cannot fix, with a hard tenderness that has no answer. Those who left us also left marks of courage. Mara's grin, the day she waved as the convoy left, was a cut of light. Tomas's scarf that the boy clutched looked like a banner of survival. On the practical side, life resumed its daily arithmetic. We patched the pump house frames, replaced membranes as best we could, and set up a guarded rotation. The harbor imposed stricter entry rules and taught neighbors the art of camouflaging caches and disguising routes. I taught others to solder and to keep signals brief. I taught a young woman named Inez how to check a capacitor for bulge and how to wring the last charge out of a battery by cycling. We became a small ecosystem of skills and favors. Nature, in its slow and indifferent way, continued to change. The broader pattern, shifting currents, migrating storms, salt incursion, remained. The world had not turned back, but pockets of care created microclimates where life could take the smallest of footholds. I found, in those everyday acts, rerouting a trickle of runoff to a new seedbed, trading soldering time for a week's ration, a reason to wake up and measure my days in small wins. And the radio. It came back, not with a heroic anthem, but with a low, reliable heartbeat. My rebuilt rig could not beacon across half a continent anymore, but it could pulse across a valley, summon the harbor, and warn oncoming caravans of danger. I kept the schedule small, a dawn ping, an evening pulse, and an emergency burst when a convoy or a raider was spotted. The voice I used carried less authority and more honesty. It said plainly, "This is Miles. We have limited resources. We share what we can, beware the East Road." You learn to become precise with hope. There is grief. There is also work. I still carry the photograph of Jenna, folded thin in oilcloth, edges soft from being handled, and I speak her name into a dark sometimes as a private litany. The city is quieter now, its ribs more visible, but sometimes in the hush after a storm, you hear a child laugh and it sounds like a bell. That sound is a small court of miracles. We live by a new grammar. Measure, barter, protect, teach. The harbor will keep its ring for now. The raiders will lick their wounds and find other fields to harvest. The caravan found water, left debts and gifts, and carried life forward. I keep a small notebook with 2 columns, what we owe and what we can give. The entries are humble, a boot heel repaired, a filter packed, a low-voltage ping scheduled. They are meaningful. In the end, the falling action is not an ending. It is a reweighing. The blue at the bottom of the bowl remains, bruised but alive. We took enough of it to feed bodies today, and in doing so we traded a fragile, priceless voice for immediate mercy. I cannot say if I chose rightly. I can only say that, in the cool hush after the storm, children slept full. Mara planted 2 new cuttings with hands that shook, and someone somewhere heard, by means of a low, patient hum, that people had found a spring. That for now is enough to keep me tuning the antenna. The storm left us with mud on our boots and a ledger that would not forgive the choices we had made. We traded a voice for water, and the trade smelled of diesel and salt and the faint, stubborn perfume of wet soil. In the days that followed, I learned to live with both the cost and the benefit. That is what surviving looks like now. Living inside compromises and naming them, carrying them like groceries home. Hope did not arrive as a banner or a promise. It showed up as small, sensible things. A child in the caravan who learned to whistle a tune that chased away the nightmares. A harbor tech who taught me how to stretch a reverse osmosis membrane's life by rinsing it in salted rainwater before the heavy flush. Mara learning to graft a drought-hardy rootstock onto a stubborn apple scion and coaxing fruit out of soil that had long forgotten kindness. Ben and Lucia finding a scavenged capacitor that let me pulse the transmitter for 10 minutes at dawn and 10 at dusk. A single 10-minute pulse is a merciful thing in a world where silence is common. The generator never truly recovered. It sleeps in a corner of the pump house like an old guardian with one good eye. The radio, rebuilt on a smaller scale, runs on a prayer and a careful power budget. I learned to make the voice count. Short pulses, coded check-ins, and a strict schedule so other people could plan around it. We use low-power bursts now, not to boast, but to conserve what energy we have for when the world says it needs us. There is a practical lesson here that I learned with the kind of stubborn clarity that comes from losing things you once took for granted. Redundancy saves lives. Keep 2 ways to purify water if you can, charcoal and sand for taste and grit, and a way to boil if you must. Keep spare wire, solder, and a roll of insulating tape in the same place you keep your seeds. Hide your caches where children play and thieves might not think to look. Bury them under ordinary things. Teach someone to solder, even if they laugh at the ugly joints at first. Knowledge travels further than a crate of canned peaches. But the practical lesson sits beside the moral one. Every mercy we choose closes a door somewhere else. The pump that gave us water that night left a wound in the network of sound I had tried to keep steady.